Todd Richards here, Roots, Hearts,
and Soul.
Stefan and I are launching this podcast based off cookbook Roots, Heart, and Soul by myself, Todd Richards, with a great help from Chef Stefan, the man, the myth, the legend himself.
Oh, you stop, you. We have such a beautiful history together.
I mean, it's crazy. Really, what people are going to get from this podcast is telling the story of Afro people, Afro cuisine.
We're going to be telling the story of the Pan-African diaspora.
Roots, heart, soul of the world, as we say. We are launching in a couple of weeks here. Some terrific guests. Stay tuned. Follow us on all our social media at Chef Todd Richards in all formats. Chef Stefan, what's yours?
ChefStefan.it, AYITI. This is the correct way to say Haiti.
Well, we're getting education already.
So if you want to find out more, if you want to listen to great stories being told by amazing, amazing culinary talents, we're going to be hearing stories from Africa all the way to the Caribbean, all the way to the Americas. It's going to be something special.
Giving everyone the good rhythm, the good vibes.
Yeah, baby.
We look forward to seeing everyone. Talk soon.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
Westholme is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways. Hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pitmasters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Ella Palmer. Y'all, I'm so excited today. I have my dear friend, colleague, someone who I highly respect, Dr. Malinda Maynard Lowery, who is a historian, a documentary film producer. She is a member of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina. She joined Emory University as the Cahoon Family Professor of American History in 2021. She even taught at UNC Chapel Hill for 12 years and 4 years at Harvard University. Her books, The Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle, as well as her other book, Lumbee Indians in the Jim Crow South, Race, Identity, and the Making of a Nation, are some of my favorite books. She has a host of films. She's written articles. She's done so much work. And Malinda Maynard Lowery, in one word, is a badass. Our other guest, Hannah Goins, is a member of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina. She received her JD with certification in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy and MPS in Indigenous Governance from the University of Arizona. And she has her BA in American Indian Studies from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. They both are working on a major project that we are collaborating on, and we're going to talk all about it in this episode. But I'm so excited to have them on here. And just a little side note about how I know Malinda. I was an extra in her film Lumbeeland, as well as I've known her for quite some time now. I respect her work. She's doing so much to lift up Indigenous voices in the South and preserve their stories and traditions. But aside from that, my mother's grandmother was named Zella Locklear, who I am named after. And I have a long line of Locklears from North Carolina, from Fayetteville. Melissa, Arthur, Andrew, Locklear. And so my roots run deep in Eastern North Carolina on both sides of my family. So I'm so excited to have her on here. And we're going to talk about being Lumbee in Eastern North Carolina and all about Indigenous foodways in the South and their contributions. Welcome.
Thank you. It is so great to be here. And you know, Zella, I have always admired your work in New Orleans. So when I found out that you had Lumbee people, anyway, that just completed the circle.
Yes. It's a beautiful thing, and you all have been so kind to me, and I really appreciate that. And you all were so kind to my mother and my children, so I'm really grateful for you all for that. And I will continue to hold up the torch and come down there and do anything I can to support the work that you all are doing. So thank you. But I want to get into just starting with you, Malinda, about growing up Lumbee, which is the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi. I want to talk about just some of your memories of growing up. And then Hannah, I'd like you to come in and just, kind of fill in your spaces because you're in a different generation. I would love to know what it was like growing up as a Lum and your experiences.
Well, Zella, my earliest memories revolve around food. I remember a birthday cake that, just probably a regular box cake, right, that my mother made for me, but it was my mother's cake, right? And I was raised 2 hours away from the Lumbee homeland. I was raised in Durham, North Carolina, where my parents both worked, and, we hosted folks from home. When we say home, we mean Pembroke, Robeson County, southeastern North Carolina. Even though we lived in Durham and Durham was a home, Durham was not our spiritual home. Robeson County was our spiritual home. So when we say home, we mean Robeson County. But even as a very, very young person, like a toddler, I remember folks visiting us when, for example, they had relatives in the hospital at Duke, right? Or when they were going to school, we had our first crop of Lumbee lawyers, the previous generation to Hannah. The first crop of Lumbee attorneys were trained at North Carolina Central University, for the most part, historically black college in Durham, where both of my parents were professors. And so we had law students, staying with us for a night here and there or a couple weeks at a time, or they would just come eat meals with us. And then when we would go home for weekends to see grandparents and other, aunts and uncles, my mother would always bring back vegetables, whoever's vegetables she could she could get, especially if somebody had a bumper crop of squash. We were always eating that, for the next week. Somebody had a bumper crop of collards. We were eating that for the next week. Those are the two vegetables that I remember the most, but I know we had lots of others too. And so being able to just kind of stay connected to home through food and through shared gatherings, whether the food was like distinctly Lumbee or prepared in a way that our ancestors and family would have done, that was almost less important than the fact that it was Lumbee people eating it. And so I always grew up with this strong connection between my cultural identity and our food ways, even 2 hours away from the homelands.
What about you, Hannah?
I think, well, I'm a vegetarian in the South, in Lumbeeland. So when I think about childhood and food, I just remember a lot of like being made to eat stuff. And I think through the research we've been doing recently, it just might be a point to speak about later. But when I think about being a kid and food in Lumbee, I think about a lot of stuff I couldn't eat, and I think about a lot of sweets that I could eat. So like the layer cake, the red velvet cake, all of that. That was my thing. I just remember being with family a lot. Like, there's not too much to do, like outside of the home, I feel like in Robeson County. So yeah, just playing outside a lot. I'm the oldest sister. I have 3 younger sisters, so a lot of chasing them around and trying to be somebody's second mama. But yeah, I've moved all around Robeson County. I think until I was 5, I lived in Roland, and then my dad actually had a few different jobs, and we moved around a lot until I was back in 5th grade. And then we came back to Pembroke. I'd been living in like Johnston County, Smithfield, up closer towards Raleigh. And ever since 5th grade, I've been in Pembroke. Went to Pembroke Elementary, Middle, Purnell, and I went to UNCP. It wasn't until I went to law school that I had lived out of the state, and people, asking me for the first time what I'm saying multiple times. They can't understand the accent, that type of thing. So I'm back in Robeson County since December, so it's nice to be back home for a little bit.
That's nice. That's nice. I always like going to Fuller's Old Fashioned Barbecue and just seeing the variety of food that Lumbees, have to offer. And it's just such a sacred place for so many when they come and visit and return to the land. And I know
it's
that
a destination for sure.
For sure. And I just remember, that was a place where I was able to eat with my parents. And that was one of the last memories I have of them in North Carolina, And so when they were alive. And so collard sandwiches, grape ice cream, chicken bog, blooming onions, rutabagas, all of that are rooted, I think, in Lumbee food and culture. But I would love for you, Malinda, to talk about, we're going to go back in time before we really delve into Lumbee foodways and the contributions of Native Americans, specifically in North Carolina, to Southern cuisine. I want to talk about, for our listeners who aren't aware, who Henry Berry and Rhoda Lowery are and their love story, which was rooted in resistance. I would love for you to talk about the Tide Mule incident and just how their love story really set the precedent for land grabbing, as well as, just Black and Native resistance toward.
Yeah, well, so Henry Berry Lowery and Rhoda Lowery met, I'm going to say, in 1863. So if your listeners know a little bit about history, American history, that was some of the darker times of the Civil War. The whole time period was dark, but 1863 was a particularly dark time. And especially for anyone who sympathized with the Union but was living in the South, in the Confederacy. And so Henry Berry Lowery's parents and aunts and uncles, many of them were most likely, we believe, sympathizers with the Union who did not trust the slave-holding Confederacy and its ideologies of racial white supremacy. And interestingly, when Henry Berry and Rhoda married in late 1865, one of the distinct things that's written down is about food. At that time period, Lumbee people, some of us were literate, but many of us were not leaving behind written records. So when historians are looking at that time period, we have to look at the records left by non-Native people, which distort, right? Anybody who's resisting that regime of white supremacy, if there's a non-Native living in the area that's writing about them, they're not writing very nice things, right? They're writing about how poor we are or how violent we are. But one of the things that a non-Native woman wrote about Henry Berry and Rhoda related to their wedding feast. And in December 1865, they married, and as this one person wrote, they had a 7-foot-long table that was laden with food. And the Civil War is kind of remembered in our community as our starvation time, because the Confederate Home Guard was coming to raid our farms and take the things that we had grown and preserved for ourselves and redistribute them to the Confederate Army. So we were being starved out in 1863, 1864, 1865, and yet people marshaled enough to bring food to the wedding feast of Henry Berry Lowery and Rhoda Lowery. And so having food be at the center of that kind of love story, or anyway, part of the origin of the love story, means that we can also talk about things like food insecurity, and we can talk about war and starvation and the impact of that, because shortly after this, Henry Berry was actually arrested at his wedding after this meal because he was wanted by the county authorities, the sheriff's department, for a murder that he had allegedly committed. And he had spent the previous 9 months or so hiding out, but came out into the open for his wedding. There was this great celebration. And then at the conclusion of the ceremony and the meal, he was taken away in chains. And the reason for the accusation and the arrest goes back to a traumatic incident for all of us, but particularly for that couple, for Rhoda and Henry. Henry's father and brother had been executed by a white mob in the spring of 1865. And that event set off a resistance movement that we now call the Lowery War, meaning referencing kind of the Lowery family and Henry Berry and Rhoda's family, but actually the Lowery War encompassed members of the Black community, members of the white community, people who also sympathized with the Union in that particular time and had been resisting the Confederacy for the whole of the Civil War. But the Lowery Gang was a multiracial coalition of people. There were 7 or 10 men who were at the kind of the center of the activity, but they were defending a larger community of Native Black and white folks who, for the most part, were not well off. They were experiencing that starvation that the war brought, and they were looking for a voice, an advocate, somebody to strike back against the murders, the starvation, the oppression that they had all been experiencing. And Henry Berry Lowery and Rhoda kind of became those voices. Henry Berry disappeared in 1872, and rather than be caught by North Carolina troops and law enforcement officials that had been hunting him and the other gang members, he vanished and left Rhoda there to raise their 3 children. Rhoda herself became involved in another kind of, foodways related activity. She became a bootlegger. She made and sold, I don't know if it was wine or whiskey, but she made and sold whiskey in such quantities that she attracted the attention of law enforcement and was sent to prison for this activity I believe in the first decade of the 1900s. So, so being able to survive after the disappearance of her husband, for Rhoda was all about continuing to use, the plants, the techniques, the ways of being and eating and nourishing ourselves that the Confederate South had tried to deny us. And so even though the kind of formal resistance period concluded in 1872, Rhoda continued to resist, and just her very survival was a form of resistance that we today treasure, think about, talk about. We hold it up as an example of the persistence and survivance of Lumbee women in the face of incredible adversity. So Henry Berry's story lives on, but Rhoda's story lives on also. Non-natives sometimes are not as aware of her and her role in this time period, but we treasure it, and we talk about her and her children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I was reading one of your articles because you have so many amazing body of work. I mean, you have A Chef's Life, a film that you produced and from 2013, Somewhere South, Road to Race Day. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And then I was reading one of your articles and I took a stanza from it, and I would love for you to kind of talk about that. But it says, on Thanksgiving, the day we were filming, my cousin described for me the question he often got about Lumbees. What kind of food do y'all eat? They ask. Well, I like my mom's fried chicken the best, he says. That's our food. That's Lumbee food. The real question these well-intentioned folks are asking is, how can you be Indians if you don't fit my stereotype? But our stove, oven, and table were full of such things that day, and full of singing, while my mother and aunt sang hymns a cappella and in flawless harmony as they fried cornbread. My uncle played keyboard nearby with a round of cousins singing along, and my grandmother chimed in as she chopped the day's collards. Our new neighbors have appropriated the abundance our own ancestors cultivated, denied it to us, and then marginalized our influence on their cuisine. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about that or what you said?
Yeah, it's always been true that Lumbee people celebrated Thanksgiving. Hannah, I know in your family, y'all do the same thing. It's like, I had a friend make a joke one time. Oh, I'm going to go spend Thanksgiving with the Indians. Or he thought it was weird to spend Thanksgiving with the Indians. Because of the story of the first Thanksgiving and how that's been taken out of our control and turned into some like Puritan whatever. And a lot of Native people in the Northeast, of course, that Thanksgiving is a day of mourning for them. But when my father heard my friend make this kind of snarky remark, my father just turned to him and said, well, it's a harvest celebration, reminding this friend who was from New York that we have our own versions of these events and we have our own history, our own story to tell around food and about food. And that story, it may not look like what an outsider thinks an Indian story should look like. On the one hand, you see stereotypes about Native people that revolve around our violence and our so-called savagery, and then on the other hand, you see stereotypes that revolve around our nobility or how so-called, connected to nature and all these things that we are. But the noble savage stereotype also contains a victimization narrative, and you're only noble if you are a perfect victim. And so we as Lumbee people, we refuse that victimization stereotype. We don't think of ourselves as victims, especially around a holiday like Thanksgiving, when our ancestors instruct us to celebrate and give thanks for our abundance that we've cultivated. We refuse to see ourselves as victims. And that goes back to that Henry Berry and Rhoda story and lots of other incidents in our history where we have, rather than succumb to injustice or oppression, we fight it. And in the case of my work and what Hannah and I are working on together, like we're fighting that with stories, with a narrative, and trying to pick apart, critique the narrative of Southern foodways that just straight up ignores Native people for the most part. I mean, we're having a little bit more awareness now with some of the media work that you referenced, Zella, but most of the narrative around Southern foodways just ignores, Native people, not only our contributions to it in the form of ingredients like corn, but also our contemporary present day engagement with Southern cuisine and our elaboration of it, our refinement of it, the ways that we take it to new levels are ignored in our current conversation because we don't fit that victim stereotype, because we continually tell our own story. So we use foodways and we use narrative and we use storytelling as a kind of contemporary form of resistance or refusal of those stereotyped portrayals.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland, guided by their natural ecosystems. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangelands experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that address grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westhome.com.
This is exciting because I know you've already been doing the work for a long time, but this is our official announcement that you are our Mellon Fellow for Dillard University Ray Charles program, thanks to the Mellon Foundation. And you are going to do a series of projects, which we're super excited about. And I would love for you to give our audience a sneak peek on just what to look forward to, because we appreciate your work. And I want to make sure that, that your work is heard. And you're absolutely right. I remember when I first was a young food historian, and it always, took me aback when I would hear journalists or, and just food journalists or food media always put either Native or African last. And that was just wild to me, when you think about who was actually cultivating the land. And it's not to say that Europeans weren't cultivating the land, because there were, definitely farmers that were cultivating the land, but to have them as last and barely mentioned is ahistorical.
It's just wrong. Yeah. I mean, it's just so wrong. And I think even European Americans would have recognized in the past the importance of African and indigenous contributions to what they were eating and growing and cooking,
Absolutely.
And so for all of that to get rewritten now, we can see it as a product of the segregated 20th century, of this Jim Crow period. And and it reinforces the idea that Jim Crow segregation was not some kind of natural outgrowth of time periods before that. It was a new system. It was a system that was intentionally designed in new and concentrated ways to disenfranchise people who had been formerly enslaved, in the case of people of African descent, and people who are Afro-Indigenous and living either as free persons or as enslaved persons, as well as the erasure of people within indigenous nations that are persisting in their farming and their food ways, And so for us to see segregation as kind of a new system, a distinct system of repression, it's very present when we hear about the way that Southern food is talked about and who are the key representatives of Southern food, which increasingly, thanks to your work, Zella, and also like shows like High on the Hog or the work of the Tallgrass Food Box here in North Carolina, like there are lots of folks that are in a concerted way resisting those and putting themselves out there as purveyors of Southern foodways and also experts, but our mainstream culture has a long way to go in terms of its awareness, but we're also interested in collaborating with folks who don't see themselves as part of Southern foodways, right? Like Hannah, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your meeting a couple of weeks ago with Sean Sherman and Mecca from BIPOC Foodways Alliance, because they're not located in the South. They do think about the South and they think with partners in this region, but they're interested in the connection from, kind of a different origin place.
Me and Malinda had just started thinking about where we wanted the project to go. I had been doing some other research and I work with a nonprofit organization called First Peoples Worldwide. We try to make the business case for companies understanding and respecting Indigenous rights. And so I had to go to a conference for work called RES. It's like I think it's the Reservation Economic Summit. It was in Vegas. And it's all these, it's a huge conference. There were like 6,000 people there or something. It was in Caesar's Palace and just Indians everywhere, different kinds of businesses. There was a lot of like food vendors and food related businesses that were there. And when I was checking the agenda and just seeing what I was doing, I saw that Sean Sherman was going to be there. And I was like, oh, that's like, what if I could talk to him for a second? And Melinda was like, yeah, try and talk to him. And I was like, okay. So I get up the escalator and he's the first person I saw when I was like walking to the registration desk. And I had met him years ago at UNCP. He had came to they had like a food sovereignty. I think it's like it might have been in November, I'm not sure, but they're doing a lot of research and work with food sovereignty, and he came and, cooked for us, and he spent a few days and had a few different lectures, and it was really cool. But again, it was like maybe 5 or so years ago, so I didn't know that he'd recognize me, and he didn't until I started speaking, and he was like, "You're Lumbee." I was like, "I'm Lumbee." They know, they can tell by the voice, and I just asked him real quick, like, this is a project I'm doing. It's still early. We're trying to think about, how we want to frame this work, where we want to take it. I was like, what do you think about, when you hear Native and Black foodways in this, like, not specifically the Southeast, but with attention to the Southeast? And he got kind of excited. I didn't know his partner, Mecca, before. I didn't know about their work with BIPOC foodways. He was like, oh, my partner, it's actually, like, really interesting. She does this. And, like, he had talked to me a little bit about, how his work played into it. And I was just like, I didn't even think I'd get to see him at the conference. And so I was just like, I'd love to talk to you more. Can we meet up later? And so then I had to hunt him down the next day, like, find a time for us to meet, find somewhere quiet for us to meet. But then I got to meet his partner, Mecca, and it just felt very like fate, like it was all supposed to happen because their work is so in line with this project. He, his work is trying to decolonize the Native plate. Like, he's trying to get back to traditional foods, and a product of that, like, shows it's able to tell a story about history, about why these foods are no longer in our, regular diet. Food can be, a conversation starter for a lot of different things. But her work, is also kind of centered around decolonizing what is considered like Southern, like, Black food, because she's from Minnesota, and she had mentioned in the interview that, like, she grew up doing, like, food critic work. She was a chef, all this, like, food journalism. And she said, what was considered to be Black food never really resonated with her, being that she wasn't from the South, but also, all the stereotypes that are around what's considered Southern food and Native food, like fry bread is not good for you, and fried chicken and, mac and cheese and collard greens and all of that, while it's, delicious, it's not the healthiest thing. And, some of the meats we eat or the things that we have had in our diet have been considered scraps for other people and, just survival food. So she had framed her work being like, what we consider Southern sometimes was actually considered plantation food or food that we were cooking for other people. So what she's trying to do is get back to traditional foods that Africans would have been eating had they had those resources and, the autonomy to really make decisions about what they wanted to eat. And it was just super interesting because I just hadn't considered that perspective and how intertwined it was with Native foodways. And it just got me thinking a whole lot. It was really interesting. They've actually been doing a lot more work in North Carolina, and we're hoping to meet with them more and parse out some more ideas.
Well, I'm excited to see how this evolves. I know that you all are going to do some filming and documenting and talking to the elders. I'm also excited I think you also have, want our listeners to know a little bit about, just how the rivers intertwine. If you can talk about that with Lumbee culture and other tribes, and even talk about some of the other tribes there, because I always love seeing Mr. Greg Jacobs, from the tribal chairman from the Kahari tribe, and then the work that they've done to rematriate the Kahari River and their sorghum festival. And it's so much happening in Eastern North Carolina with many of the tribes. And I would love for you to, just talk about just some of your thoughts on the elders and how you all are going to, have them tell stories about food and some of the what's been on your mind and what you're thinking about on how you're going to approach this. But
yeah, well, before there were any state borders, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, there were rivers. Before there were interstates, before there were highways, 2-lane roads, there were rivers, and the rivers were our highways. Our people have been making canoes for anyway, I think there's recently been a canoe surfaced in the Coharie River that was 10,000 years old. I mean, maybe it has not been specifically dated yet, but at my last research, that canoe had been in that river for thousands of years. And so the Coharie River, of course, is like the Lumber River to the Coharie tribe, the sort of main artery or roadway that passes through our communities, and has been something that we have always had a close connection to and used and gathered plants around, obviously fished and hunted in the woods and the natural areas around those rivers. So the rivers, like our fields, are incredibly important sources of nutrition and culture and trade. So being able to, find, or for a canoe basically to come up. I mean, we didn't find it. The canoe found us. It's like the canoe. These ancestors, when they decide to surface something for us, they do it in a big way. And they do it in a way that reminds us of just who we are and just how long-standing our connections to these places are. Because, if you're educated in a school system in the state of North Carolina, you are not learning, and you're a Native person, you are not learning about your history. You are not learning about those rivers, and you're not learning about anything that existed really before the arrival of Europeans, because that's intentional. They're trying to hide our history from us to reduce our ability to claim land and territory and sovereignty over our own people. So, those rivers are, when the canoe surfaces, it is not only a sign from our ancestors, but it's a different kind of claim, different kind of evidence that we can begin to make for our claims, our longstanding claims in these territories. We also have the Waccamaw people who live next door to Robeson County and mostly in Columbus County and along. Also, these are all places that line up to the South Carolina border. So, we didn't cross the border crossed us. There is like this these territorial borders set down by colonial forces are actively interrupting our own systems of foodways, trade, cultural sustenance, and for Waccamaw people to be also located alongside Lumbee people very close to Coharie, also not far from Occaneechi-Saponi people, which are now located kind of in the modern, Orange County, Alamance County, and more in the Piedmont of North Carolina. There's 8 federally and state recognized tribes in the state of North Carolina, as well as 4 what we call urban Native American associations: Fayetteville, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Charlotte. So those 12 kind of combined leadership institutions in our communities, they have historic resonance and attachment. They have contemporary impact, and they're very viable going into the future. So what Coharie folks are doing is so inspiring to me, because they're focused on reconnecting to life ways and food ways that have been recently practiced, but because of displacement and the wage economy that we're all living in, Coharie folks, just like Lumbee folks, have not been as focused on farming in the last 30 years, So our ability to reconnect to the plants that our ancestors grow, there's been a lot of disconnection in a short period of time. So the wisdom of our elders is that they recognize that, and they're starting new projects to engage young people around connecting to those plants. In the case of the Coharie, it's sorghum that they're the most known for growing and harvesting. And they have events, around sorghum harvest time when, Zella, you've been there, like our other Lumbee and Coharie folks connect around the sorghum harvest in the Coharie community. And as you mentioned before, Zella, powwows, other kinds of opportunities to share our foodways come throughout the year, but we're learning to reconnect to those seasonal rhythms of harvest that, again, it's not like we haven't practiced them, but there's been a lot of disconnection over a very short period of time. And thankfully, to the wisdom of our elders, they have recognized that, and now they're creating new opportunities for young people to relearn and reengage. The Lumbee Cultural Center outside Pembroke is also doing this in the way of a community garden, and we have Lumbee farmers. There's a wonderful resource in the form of a couple, Mr. Millard and Miss Connie Locklear. They run the New Ground Farm, also in Robeson County. They recently won an award from North Carolina Agricultural Extension for Small Farmer of the Year because of the reconnection they're doing, both around plants used for food, but also plants used for medicinal purposes.
I love to hear that. I love to hear that. I want to talk about your latest film, Lumbeeland, and just, some of the background about the film. You directed, produced the film. It was it was a short film that told a story. I'll let our listeners, you can explain about the film, but it was such an experience to be there, and food was a component of Lumbeeland as well. And I was in the scene, and me and Amy
Yes.
and just had a good time. And we were in the church, and in the mock scene church, and it was so much fun. So I would love for you to talk about your latest film and just your creative process in producing and filming Lumbeeland.
Yeah, well, without taking too much crazy time, I think this is a film that is informed by my historical scholarship, especially around the drug war in the 1980s in Lumbee territory, and the drug economy and the way that takes, the form that takes today. And it's a story about a family who's really wrestling with reaping with reaping what they sow, to use another kind of farming, agricultural, foodways metaphor. Like, sometimes as Native people, we realize that we are reaping we're reaping a harvest that not only our ancestors planted, but which colonizers and invaders are forcing us to reap. Mm-hmm. And so Lumbee engagement with the drug economy is a response to generations of dispossession and an inability to tell our own story, the ways that our story has been intentionally hidden from us. And the film was a way to kind of fictionalize that story. I've done a lot of research on it and published on it, but being able to say, how do we navigate this in the present day? It required a kind of fictional telling. So being able to share the context of that, of course we have to feature church, right? Of course we have to feature a big family meal, in the film, Zella, the scene that you were in where we got to eat was a birthday party scene, and our Lumbee birthday parties, they're like family reunions. Every year we would go to we would go down for my grandfather's birthday, December 27th, right after Christmas. And there was always food, there was singing, there was celebration. And we don't expect members of our family to be perfect. We know that they have coping mechanisms with things that have happened to them that maybe, we wouldn't wish for them, but we also love and respect them as human beings. So that scene was, inspired by not just my own family celebrations, but all the family celebrations that I've been to around our community over the years. And so one of the fun things about the film is there's a cake that sort of takes a central role, anyway, a visual central role in the film. And when Lumbee's, it's the first shot of the trailer for the film. Maybe in our show notes we could share the link to the trailer. But it's the first shot of the trailer of the film, and it's just been so fun to have Lumbee people reaching out to me, text messages, emails, seeing me around in the community and saying, who's got the recipe for that cake? We need that cake. I want the recipe, and the little emojis commenting on our social media posts, like the little mouth watering, smiley face emoji. So like people are connecting to the story partly because of what we're able to show about our culture. And we know that as Lumbee people, we live in a holistic universe where many things are true at the same time. We can be engaged in something dysfunctional as the drug economy and still celebrate who we are and our ancestors through our foodways. We do both.
That's powerful. That's powerful. I'm excited to see where, your research, you and Hannah's research evolves. I know our listeners will be, and I'll definitely invite y'all back to talk about it after, you go through this journey that y'all are about to go on. And I'm excited that, the ancestors brought Sean and Mecca, into the fold. So it's going to be exciting to see what you all find and what is already there. It just needs to come back out in the 21st century. So, and we know, that when I look at some of the resistance movements, starting from Henry Berry and Rhoda Lowery, and so many other Native resistance movements, AIM, American Indian Movement, a lot of it had to do with sovereignty, access to healthy food and water and so much more. And I would love for you to give just maybe some final thoughts on some of your thoughts on just Native food ways now.
Yeah, well, Hannah, you live there every day. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
I mean, I feel like I'm a very picky eater, which is my mom. When I told her I was starting this project, she said, well, maybe Malinda can get you to be an actual vegetarian because it's hard around the house. I mean, God, I want a carb. I want it's hard to find super healthy foods unless you're cooking, right? Like it seems like every time we get a new restaurant, it's like a chicken restaurant or something. I get that. I understand that.
Fast food.
Fast food. So it can be difficult, I think, to have access to what we would consider healthy food, like not just the fact that it's not here and you have to drive like 2 hours to get to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or something like that. But I think where I've been finding like I have to get creative, there are so many farms. Like there are so many, not necessarily farmers markets, but it's like you can pull up on somebody and get some vegetables if you need to. You can't just have it cooked for you at a restaurant, but it's accessible. I think as Lumbee people, like we always have to think outside of the box. I think Arlinda put that quote. You quoted Arlinda in your last book, Malinda. I forget exactly how it says, but it's basically talking about how like state-recognized tribes have to think outside of the box to assert their sovereignty. So I think Lumbee is no different. Like we don't have access to as many things. We're not super close to the bigger cities, but we make do in different ways. And I am seeing like younger people get more involved in farming or what's it called with the water, the hydro, or like just different levels of connecting and getting back into gardening and doing things like that. So that's been interesting. But yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes. When you were asking about the elders earlier, I don't know if y'all seen this video on like Facebook or TikTok, but it's some man getting real upset because women like don't cook as much anymore, and he just starts yelling. He's like, we're losing recipes, like y'all aren't taking this serious. And I was like, no, that's next. I don't know how to do the same things, but I think that's where elders play a role. It's like we have to make a concerted effort to keep these recipes going, to keep like Lumbee food, like passing it down to next generation. So I'm excited to talk to elders. I'm excited to get some new recipes. I'll do a quick little plug. My cousin Morgan Dees, she's the owner of a company called BJack. They have like different apparel and stickers and stuff. But my favorite thing that they've ever done is they put together a cookbook, and it's a Lumbee cookbook. And she went to different members of the family and had them write down, these recipes. And it's available on their website. It's like 15 books. And I saw her recently at UNCP's powwow, and they had some of the cookbooks. And I felt like I was working for them. I kept telling, I was like, why don't y'all go get these cookbooks? Like, y'all do so much work because y'all don't understand. Y'all sleep on the cookbooks. But I feel like there's like a vibe of revitalization around like people my age. Like I feel like that's the thing now in mid-20s. We're like, we should learn how to cook. We should like, that's what I get excited about. So
I love to hear that. We will include, if you want to share it, we will include the links so our listeners can purchase a copy if to support your family if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
That would be great.
I just want to also note that Zella, when I asked Hannah to join us today, the first thing she said to me was, well, I don't know if you want this cornbread accent.
What?
And Hannah, I also just want to say your voice is lovely, and it's one of the reasons why I'm enjoying our work so much together is I get to hear you talk. But the fact that you called it cornbread, I mean, that's beautiful. It kind of says it all in terms of like who we are. We're rooted in this cornbread. That's what we are. Just that sense of like we live in a way that we embody our ancestors and their traditions,
Absolutely. And there's nothing like a collard sandwich with cornbread. So if you've never had it in your life, I enjoy going down there to get the authentic version of it twice a year or many times as I can come back. So I really enjoy collard sandwiches, especially at Fuller's as well, and just getting some of that cornbread. But I want to thank y'all so much for coming on Culture and Flavor. This was such a pleasure. And I know we can talk more, and we're going to have a part 2 when you all are done with your research and to talk about just some of your experiences. I know that, some of our listeners will start following you and just, finding out more about your work. And I just want to continue to lift up Native voices and Native foodways because they were the first. So thank you, Malinda, and thank you, Hannah, for joining us.
Thank you, Zella, for just supporting this work and for recognizing it. Many, many thanks to the center and Jessica, the Mellon Foundation. We're just so excited to get to do it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.